Imagine standing before a structure so magnificent that a Portuguese monk in 1586 declared it of such extraordinary construction that it is not possible to describe it with a pen. Picture a monument that dwarfs the Vatican City by 4 times its size, rises from the Cambodian jungle like a fever dream made of stone, and contains more raw material than all the pyramids of Egypt combined. Now imagine that this architectural impossibility was built not in the age of steel and steam, not with modern cranes and concrete, but in the 12th century, when the rest of the world was still struggling with basic masonry. This is Angkor Wat, and its story will shatter everything you thought you knew about medieval engineering. Covering 162.6 hectares and recognized by Guinness World Records as the largest religious structure on Earth, Angkor Wat stands as humanity's most audacious act of faith carved in stone. But this isn't just a story about building the impossible. It's about how a civilization in Southeast Asia achieved what European kingdoms couldn't even dream of, centuries before the Renaissance touched Western shores. The question isn't just how they built it. The question is how they built it first. To understand the magnitude of what we're about to explore, we must first transport ourselves to a world where Cambodia wasn't the modest kingdom you know today, but the beating heart of Southeast Asia's most powerful empire. This is the story of the Khmer Empire at its absolute zenith. A civilization so advanced, so prosperous, and so ambitious that it would attempt something no one had ever dared before. From the 9th to the 15th century, the Khmer Empire dominated Southeast Asia, stretching across what is now Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam. But calling it merely an empire undersells its true nature. This was a civilization that had mastered the fundamental challenge that has defeated countless societies throughout history: the conquest of water itself. At its height, the medieval metropolis of Angkor was home to 750,000 people, making it the largest pre-industrial city in the world. Larger than London, larger than Paris, larger than any European capital would be for centuries to come. But size alone doesn't capture the true genius of what the Khmer achieved. They had solved the puzzle of tropical agriculture in a way that would make modern engineers weep with admiration. Cambodia receives 1.5 meters of rain during the monsoon season from May to November, nearly 90% of its annual rainfall. Then comes the dry season, with temperatures soaring to 40 degrees Celsius. Most civilizations would have been crushed by such extremes. The Khmer Empire didn't just survive them, they turned this climate into their greatest weapon. They built an extensive, advanced system of artificial canals, dikes, and reservoirs, the largest of which, West Baray, stretches 5 miles long and 1.5 miles wide. This wasn't just impressive, it was revolutionary. The water harnessed by this network slaked the thirst of 750,000 residents and irrigated the rice fields that fed them all. Imagine, while European cities were still dumping waste into their drinking water and praying that plague wouldn't visit them next, the Khmer had created a hydraulic civilization that could have supplied water to medieval London 10 times over. But the Khmer Empire's true genius lay not in what they built, but in how they thought. This was a civilization that understood something profound about the relationship between the earthly and the divine, between political power and cosmic order. Hindu temples are not places for religious congregation. Instead, they are homes of the gods. For a king to lay claim to his political office, he had to prove that the gods did not support his predecessors or his enemies. To this end, the king had to build the grandest temple palace for the gods, one that proved more lavish than any previous temples. It was into this world of limitless ambition and technological mastery that Suryavarman II was born. Reigning from 1113 to approximately 1150 CE, he inherited not just a throne, but a divine mandate that demanded he surpass every king who had come before him. He inherited an empire at the peak of its powers, commanding resources that European monarchs could scarcely imagine. And most importantly, he inherited a civilization that had already proven it could bend the natural world to its will. Angkor Wat was part of the city of Angkor, the center of the Khmer Empire, one of the most prosperous and successful empires in Southeast Asia. This wasn't just a regional power. This was a civilization that had achieved something approaching the impossible. They had created abundance from scarcity, turned jungle into metropolis, and built a society so stable and so wealthy that they could contemplate projects that would make pharaohs envious. The young king looked out over his domain and saw opportunity where others would have seen impossibility. He saw vast quarries of sandstone in the Kulin Hills, waiting to be carved. He saw rivers that could transport massive stones across impossible distances. He saw forests full of elephants that could be pressed into service as living cranes. Most importantly, he saw a population of skilled craftsmen, engineers, and laborers who had already proven they could work miracles in stone and water. But Suryavarman II had something else. He had a vision that would make every previous royal building project look like a child's sandcastle. Suryavarman II wanted to show everyone that he was indeed a king god, by building something so grandiose that it must be divine. He would build not just a temple, but a representation of the universe itself. He would create Mount Meru, the cosmic center of creation, right here on Earth. The temple was intended to represent the center of Suryavarman II's empire and symbolize his power and influence. But this wasn't megalomania. This was statecraft on a cosmic scale. In a world where divine approval was the ultimate source of political legitimacy, Suryavarman II would build something so magnificent, so technically impossible, so audaciously beautiful that no one could question whether the gods favored his reign. The stage was set for the most ambitious construction project in human history, an empire at its peak, a king. What Suryavarman II envisioned wasn't just a temple. It was nothing less than a three-dimensional map of the cosmos itself, a stone encyclopedia of Hindu cosmology that would serve as both his earthly capital and his eternal mausoleum. But to understand the true audacity of what he planned, we must first understand the impossible mathematical and spiritual precision that Khmer architects would have to achieve. In Hindu cosmology, Mount Meru stands as the sacred center of the universe, a golden mountain with 5 peaks, surrounded by concentric oceans and mountain ranges, supporting the heavens above and anchoring the earth below. Now imagine the challenge. How do you transform this abstract spiritual concept into 162.6 hectares of carved stone that functions not just as religious symbol, but as actual architecture? The architects, whose names have been lost to history, but whose genius echoes through the centuries, faced a puzzle that would have broken lesser minds. They had to create a structure that was simultaneously a temple, a royal palace, a cosmic diagram, and an engineering marvel. Every measurement had to align with celestial movements. Every architectural element had to serve both practical and spiritual purposes. Every carved stone had to contribute to a grand design that was, quite literally, universal in scope. The central tower of Angkor Wat represents Mount Meru itself, while the 4 surrounding towers represent the mountain's subsidiary peaks. But this wasn't mere symbolism. The architects embedded astronomical calculations into the very structure. The temple was oriented to the west, an unusual choice for Hindu temples that were typically east-facing. Scholars believe this orientation was deliberate. It aligned with the setting sun and possibly with Suryavarman II's conception of the temple as his final resting place, where he would join Vishnu in the afterlife. The three concentric galleries that encircle the central sanctuary represent the successive realms of existence, rising from the chaotic outer world to the divine center. The enormous moat that surrounds the entire complex, measuring approximately 1,500 meters by 1,300 meters, represents the cosmic ocean at the edge of the world. Even the 617-foot bridge that provides access to the site serves as more than mere passage. It represents the rainbow bridge that connects the earthly realm to the divine. But here's where the true genius reveals itself. According to ancient Sanskrit and Khmer texts, religious monuments must be organized in harmony with the universe, planned according to the rising sun and moon, and designed to symbolize the recurrent time sequences of days, months, and years. The architects of Angkor Wat didn't just read these texts, they solved them like a cosmic equation. Recent archaeological research has revealed that embedded within Angkor Wat's construction is a precise map of the cosmos, a mandala that functions on multiple levels simultaneously. The distances between temples, the height of towers, the length of galleries, nothing was arbitrary. Every measurement was calculated to reflect cosmic proportions and celestial cycles. Consider the mathematical precision required. The outer wall of Angkor Wat measures 1,025 by 802 meters, but these aren't random numbers. They correspond to cosmic measurements described in ancient Hindu texts. The central tower rises to precisely 65 meters above ground level, again reflecting cosmic proportions. The temple complex contains exactly 1,728 steps, a number that holds deep significance in Hindu cosmology as it represents the number of years in each cosmic cycle. But the architects faced an even more daunting challenge. They had to make all of this work as actual architecture. A cosmic diagram is one thing, a building that people can walk through, that can support massive stone roofs, that can withstand tropical storms and earthquakes for nearly a millennium. That's something else entirely. The solution they devised was revolutionary. They created a hybrid architectural system that combined the traditional Khmer temple mountain design with the newer concept of concentric galleries. The Temple Mountain represented the cosmic center, while the galleries allowed for elaborate bas-relief narratives and provided structural support for the massive stone roofs. The outer enclosure alone covers 203 acres and was originally occupied not just by the temple proper, but by an entire city complete with royal palace, administrative buildings, and residential areas for the temple's service population. Unlike the stone temple itself, these secular buildings were constructed of perishable materials, which is why only their foundations remain today. But their original presence reveals the true scope of the project. This wasn't just a temple. It was an entire sacred city designed as a microcosm of the universe. The layout follows a mandala pattern, a sacred geometric design that represents the cosmos, with alternating enclosures ascending toward the central tower. Each level becomes progressively more sacred, more restricted, more refined, until finally you reach the central sanctuary, where Vishnu himself was believed to reside. Perhaps most remarkably, the architects designed the temple so that it functions as a celestial calendar. The alignment of towers, the positioning of galleries, the length of causeways, all of these work together to track the movements of the sun, moon, and stars throughout the year. During the spring equinox, the sun rises directly over the central tower when viewed from the western entrance. During other celestial events, different architectural features align with astronomical phenomena. This wasn't just ambitious, it was impossible by any reasonable standard. No civilization had ever attempted to build the universe before. But the Khmer Empire in 1116 CE wasn't interested in reasonable standards. They were about to prove that the impossible was merely another word for not yet accomplished. The cosmic blueprint was complete. The mathematical calculations were finished. The spiritual significance was encoded into every measurement. Now came the really hard part. They actually had to build it. Picture this. You need to move between 5 and 10 million blocks of sandstone, each weighing anywhere from 440 to 660 pounds, with some monster blocks tipping the scales at over 1,500 kilograms. You need to transport them across 50 kilometers of jungle, river, and swampland. You have no steel, no combustion engines, no hydraulic cranes, no concrete, no modern tools whatsoever. You have wood, rope, human muscle, and elephants. Oh, and you need to do this roughly 1,000 years before the Industrial Revolution. Welcome to the logistical nightmare that Khmer engineers solved with such elegant efficiency that it makes modern construction projects look clumsy by comparison. The first challenge was simply staggering. Where do you find 5 to 10 million blocks of perfect sandstone? The answer lay in the Kulin Hills, a sandstone plateau located between 31 and 50 kilometers northeast of the construction site. But this wasn't just any sandstone. This was a specific type of fine-grained, durable stone that could be carved with extraordinary precision and would resist tropical weathering for nearly a millennium. The quarrying operation alone represented an industrial undertaking of unprecedented scale. Workers had to identify the best stone, extract it without damaging it, and then shape it into transportable blocks. But here's what makes your head spin. Many of these blocks were pre-carved at the quarry site. The Khmer weren't just moving raw stone, they were moving finished architectural components that had been carved to precise specifications before they ever left the mountain. Archaeological evidence suggests that master carvers worked directly at the quarry sites, roughing out architectural elements and even beginning the intricate bas-relief work that would eventually cover the temple walls. This meant that quality control and artistic vision had to be coordinated across vast distances, with carvers at the quarries working from detailed plans and specifications that matched the cosmic blueprint designed for the temple. But getting the stone out of the ground was only the beginning. Now comes the truly impossible part: transportation. How do you move 5 to 10 million blocks of stone across 50 kilometers of some of the most challenging terrain on Earth? For decades, scholars assumed the blocks were floated down canals to Tonle Sap Lake and then upstream on the Siem Reap River, a circuitous route of 90 kilometers. But recent satellite imagery and field surveys have revealed something far more sophisticated: a purpose-built transportation network that represents one of history's greatest engineering achievements. Using Google Earth Maps, researchers discovered what appeared to be straight lines leading from the quarries directly to Angkor. Field surveys revealed the truth. These lines were a series of canals, connected by short stretches of road and river that created a direct 37-kilometer route from quarry to construction site. This wasn't just clever, it was revolutionary. The Khmer engineers had literally rewritten the geography of Cambodia to serve their construction project. They dug canals where none existed, dredged rivers to make them navigable for heavy loads, and created an entirely artificial transportation network that could handle the continuous flow of millions of stone blocks over several decades. But even with this canal system, the logistics remained mind-boggling. Consider the workforce required. Historical inscriptions suggest 300,000 workers and up to 6,000 elephants were involved in the construction. These aren't just numbers. They represent the largest coordinated construction effort in human history up to that point. To put this in perspective, the Great Pyramid of Giza, built 2,500 years earlier, required an estimated 20,000 workers. Angkor Wat required 15 times that number. These workers weren't just laborers hauling stone. The workforce included master stone carvers, hydraulic engineers, architects, mathematicians, astronomers, priests who ensured cosmic alignment, logistics coordinators who managed the flow of materials, foremen who supervised construction crews, elephant handlers who managed the living cranes, raft operators who navigated the canal system, and countless specialized craftsmen whose skills we can barely imagine today. The elephants weren't just muscle. They were precision instruments. Each elephant, properly trained, could lift and position stone blocks with an accuracy that would impress modern crane operators. They could work in coordinated teams, following complex commands to maneuver massive stones into exact positions. Archaeological evidence shows holes carved into many stones designed specifically for wooden lifting devices that elephants could manipulate. Once the blocks reached the construction site, the real engineering wizardry began. Here's what should be impossible. Not a single drop of mortar was used in Angkor Wat's construction. Not one nail, not one metal fastener, not one artificial adhesive. The entire structure, millions of stone blocks rising 65 meters into the air, stays together purely through the precision of its fitting. The stone-cutting technique was so advanced, it defies belief. Two stones were ground against each other until there were no gaps between them whatsoever. The fit was so perfect that flawless carvings could span multiple stones with no visible seam. When you see a bas-relief narrative that continues seamlessly across 3 or 4 different stone blocks, you're looking at a level of precision that modern construction rarely achieves. But precision alone wouldn't have been enough. The blocks also had to be positioned with absolute accuracy, often at considerable heights. The solution was a combination of wooden scaffolding, earthen ramps, pulley systems, and elephant power that could lift multi-ton blocks and position them with millimeter precision. Some architectural elements were so large and heavy that they required coordinated teams of multiple elephants working together like a biological construction crew. The construction process itself was a masterpiece of project management. Work proceeded simultaneously on multiple fronts. Quarrying and carving continued at the Kulin Hills. Transportation flowed continuously along the canal network, and construction advanced on different sections of the temple according to a master schedule that coordinated thousands of workers across multiple specialized teams. Quality control was maintained through a system of master craftsmen who traveled between the quarries and the construction site, ensuring that stones were properly carved and that the cosmic specifications were being met. Every block that arrived at Angkor had to fit perfectly into the grand design, both architecturally and spiritually. Perhaps most remarkably, this entire logistical nightmare was sustained for approximately 30 years without interruption. Think about that. 3 decades of continuous, coordinated effort involving hundreds of thousands of people, all working toward a single, impossibly complex vision. The result was something that modern engineers study with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. Angkor Wat has survived nearly 900 years of tropical storms, earthquakes, wars, and neglect. Buildings constructed today with steel and concrete often don't last a century. This temple, built with nothing but stone, wood, and human ingenuity, has endured almost a millennium and shows every sign of lasting another 1,000 years. The impossible logistics had been mastered. The mountains had been moved. Now it was time to carve the universe. In the workshops and construction sites of 12th century Angkor, something unprecedented was happening. Master craftsmen who had inherited techniques passed down through generations were being asked to transcend everything their ancestors had ever accomplished. They weren't just building a temple, they were carving infinity itself into stone, creating artworks that would make Renaissance masters weep with envy, and solving engineering problems that wouldn't be matched for another 800 years. These weren't just workers. They were the greatest concentration of artistic and technical genius the medieval world had ever assembled. The scope of their achievement becomes clear when you consider the numbers. Over 1,200 square meters of bas-relief carvings covering the temple walls, featuring more than 2,000 apsaras, heavenly nymphs, of which no two are identical. Each apsara required weeks of meticulous carving, and each one had to meet standards of artistic perfection that would challenge modern sculptors. But statistics barely capture the reality of what these artisans achieved. Walk through Angkor Wat today, and you're surrounded by stone poetry, narrative sculptures that tell complex stories from 8 different Hindu epics, including the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. These aren't simple decorative elements. They are sophisticated visual literature carved with such skill that you can follow epic tales simply by walking around the temple galleries. The most celebrated example is the churning of the ocean of milk, a Hindu creation story where Vishnu triumphs over evil. This bas-relief stretches across 49 meters of wall space and depicts 92 demons and 88 gods engaged in a cosmic tug-of-war, using the serpent Vasuki as a rope to churn the ocean and create the elixir of immortality. The artistic complexity is staggering. Each figure is individually carved with distinct facial expressions, body positions, and clothing details. The composition flows like a frozen dance, with hundreds of figures interacting in perfect harmony across the entire narrative sequence. What makes this even more remarkable is the carving depth, or rather the lack of it. These sculptures that appear to have such incredible three-dimensional depth are actually carved only a few centimeters into the stone surface. Through masterful use of light, shadow, and perspective, the artists created the illusion of deep relief while maintaining the structural integrity of the wall. This technique, called bas-relief, requires an understanding of optics and visual psychology that most modern artists never master. The technical challenges these craftsmen faced were unprecedented. They had to carve narrative sequences that spanned multiple stone blocks while maintaining perfect continuity across the joints. Remember, these stones were carved at the quarry, transported 50 kilometers, and then assembled at the construction site. The artists had to visualize the final composition, calculate how it would look across multiple stones, and execute their carving with such precision that when the blocks were finally positioned, the narrative would flow seamlessly without a visible break. But the genius of Khmer craftsmanship extended far beyond decorative carving. These artisans had to solve structural engineering problems that would challenge modern architects. The temple's corbel arch construction, where stones are arranged in overlapping layers that gradually narrow toward the top to form an arch, required mathematical precision and an intuitive understanding of load distribution that took generations to perfect. Consider the challenges of building the temple's soaring towers. Each tower had to be perfectly symmetrical, structurally sound, and aligned with cosmic specifications, while also being covered in intricate carvings. The lotus bud shape of these towers, symbols of beauty, fertility, prosperity, spirituality, and eternity in Hinduism, required curves and angles that pushed stone carving techniques to their absolute limits. The master builders developed innovative solutions that modern engineers still study with admiration. They created interlocking joint systems that distributed weight so effectively that the structure could withstand earthquakes, tropical storms, and nearly a millennium of weathering without mortar or metal reinforcement. They designed drainage systems within the stone itself that channeled rainwater away from vulnerable joints and carvings, protecting the structure from tropical downpours that can destroy lesser buildings in decades. Perhaps most impressively, they solved the problem of working at scale while maintaining artistic consistency. With hundreds of carvers working simultaneously across the vast project, maintaining unified artistic vision should have been impossible. Yet Angkor Wat displays a level of stylistic consistency that suggests the existence of master artists who could coordinate the work of dozens of sculptors while ensuring that every carved element contributed to the overall aesthetic and spiritual harmony of the temple. The evidence suggests a sophisticated apprenticeship system where master craftsmen passed down not just techniques, but artistic vision. Young apprentices would spend years learning to carve individual elements, leaves, flowers, geometric patterns, before being trusted with figure work. Advanced sculptors specialized in different aspects. Some became masters of facial expressions, others excelled at rendering flowing cloth or intricate jewelry. Still others focused on the precise geometric patterns that formed the cosmic backgrounds for narrative scenes. But these artisans weren't just following traditional patterns. They were innovating constantly, developing new techniques to meet the unprecedented demands of Suryavarman II's vision. They created new methods for carving deep undercuts that made stone drapery appear to flow like silk. They developed techniques for rendering complex group compositions, where dozens of figures interact in convincing spatial relationships. They pioneered methods for carving architectural details so fine that they appear to be made of wood or metal rather than stone. The organizational complexity of coordinating all this craftsmanship is almost as impressive as the artistry itself. Work had to proceed according to a master schedule that ensured architectural elements were completed in the correct sequence. Structural components had to be finished before decorative carving could begin. Bas reliefs had to be coordinated across multiple work crews to ensure narrative continuity. Quality control had to be maintained across hundreds of individual artists working simultaneously. Yet somehow it all worked. The result was a level of artistic achievement that represented the absolute pinnacle of Khmer civilization. Every surface that could be carved was transformed into art. Every architectural element served both structural and aesthetic purposes. Every decorative detail contributed to the temple's cosmic symbolism, while also displaying technical mastery that has never been equaled. These master builders weren't just constructing a building. They were creating a universe in stone, a three-dimensional encyclopedia of Hindu mythology, and a testament to human artistic achievement that would inspire wonder nearly 1,000 years later. They were proving that with sufficient skill, vision, and determination, human hands could literally carve eternity out of stone. But even as these master craftsmen worked their miracles in sandstone, they were racing against time itself. Political pressures, religious changes, and the enormous costs of the project meant that Angkor Wat had to be completed within Suryavarman II's lifetime. The question was whether human genius could outrun human mortality. Construction of Angkor Wat likely began in 1116 CE, 3 years after King Suryavarman II ascended to the throne, and ended abruptly in 1150, shortly after the king's death. These dates represent more than a construction timeline. They represent humanity's most audacious race against mortality, where 300,000 workers battled time itself to complete the impossible before their divine king joined his chosen deity in the afterlife. Think about the psychological pressure of this timeline. Every master craftsman, every engineer, every worker knew that they weren't just building for posterity. They were building against a deadline that could not be extended, negotiated, or appealed. When the king died, construction would stop, period, no exceptions. This wasn't just a construction project. It was a 30-year sprint to build the universe before time ran out. The construction had to proceed in carefully orchestrated phases, each building upon the last in a sequence that could not be altered. First came the massive foundation work. excavating trenches and filling them with compacted earth and laterite to create a solid base across 162.6 hectares. This foundation work alone represents one of the largest earth-moving projects of the medieval world, requiring the excavation and transport of hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of soil and stone. Simultaneously, the Great Moat had to be dug, a water feature measuring approximately 1,500 by 1,300 meters and containing enough water to float a navy. But this wasn't just decorative. The moat served crucial structural and spiritual functions. Structurally, it helped stabilize the massive temple foundations by controlling groundwater levels. Spiritually, it represented the cosmic ocean at the edge of the world, making Angkor Wat literally an island universe rising from primordial waters. As foundation work progressed, the complex dance of stone transportation reached its peak intensity. Day after day, year after year, rafts laden with carved sandstone blocks floated down the purpose-built canal system from the Kulin Hills. The logistics required split-second timing. Blocks had to arrive exactly when construction crews were ready for them, not before, because there was no storage space for millions of stones, and not after, because construction delays could not be tolerated. Weather became both enemy and ally in this race against time. The annual monsoon season, with its 1.5 meters of rainfall, made heavy construction work impossible for months at a time. But the Khmer engineers turned this constraint into an advantage, using the monsoon months for detailed carving work that could be done under temporary shelters while reserving the dry season for the massive stonework that required clear skies and stable footing. The dry season brought its own challenges. Temperatures soaring to 40 degrees Celsius made working with heavy stone blocks a test of human endurance that pushed workers to their physical limits. Yet work continued relentlessly because every lost day brought them closer to the ultimate deadline that no human power could extend. The construction sequence had to be perfect. The central towers could not be built until the supporting galleries were complete. The galleries could not be roofed until their walls were finished. The walls could not receive their bas-relief carvings until the structural stonework was sound. Any mistake in sequencing could delay the entire project by months or even years, time that simply did not exist. Perhaps most remarkably, the quality never suffered despite the time pressure. Every stone still had to be cut to cosmic specifications. Every carving still had to meet the highest artistic standards. Every architectural element still had to fulfill both structural and spiritual requirements. The race against time actually seemed to inspire the workers to greater heights of achievement, as if they understood they were participating in something that would outlive them all. The workforce organization required to maintain this pace borders on the miraculous. Picture 300,000 people working in coordinated teams across multiple sites simultaneously. Quarry workers extracting and carving stone 50 kilometers away, canal workers maintaining the transportation network, construction crews assembling the temple structure, artists creating the decorative elements, engineers solving technical problems as they arose, and administrators coordinating the entire vast enterprise. This wasn't just about managing people, it was about managing the flow of materials, information, and specialized skills across a project of unprecedented complexity. Master craftsmen had to travel constantly between work sites, ensuring quality control and solving technical problems. Supply chains had to function flawlessly to keep hundreds of specialized work crews supplied with the exact materials they needed exactly when they needed them. The elephant crews alone represent a logistical marvel. 6,000 elephants, each requiring daily food, water, and medical care, had to be coordinated like a living construction fleet. Each elephant had specialized training for different tasks. Some specialized in lifting and positioning heavy blocks, others in transporting materials across rough terrain, still others in the delicate work of positioning carved architectural elements with millimeter precision. As the years passed and the temple rose toward the sky, the time pressure intensified. By the 1140s, everyone involved knew they were racing against Suryavarman II's mortality. The king was aging, and there was no guarantee his successor would continue the project with the same commitment and resources. Every day became precious. Every completed section was a small victory against time. The construction crews developed innovations born of desperation and genius. They created modular construction techniques that allowed multiple teams to work simultaneously on different sections of the same structure. They developed quality control systems that could maintain standards while maximizing speed. They invented lifting and positioning techniques that could handle massive stones with unprecedented efficiency. But perhaps most impressively, they maintained the cosmic vision throughout the entire three-decade marathon. Despite the time pressure, despite the logistical nightmares, despite the physical challenges of tropical construction, every element of Angkor Wat remained true to its original conception as a stone representation of the universe. The astronomical alignments were perfect. The mathematical proportions were exact. The spiritual symbolism was complete. When Suryavarman II died around 1150 CE, construction stopped immediately, leaving some of the bas-relief decoration unfinished. But what had been completed was nothing short of miraculous. The largest religious structure in the world, built to cosmic specifications, decorated with unparalleled artistry, and engineered to last for millennia. The race against eternity had been won. Yet even as the construction crews laid down their tools and the quarries fell silent, a new challenge was already emerging. Religious winds were shifting across the Khmer Empire. Buddhism was rising while Hinduism waned. The cosmic Hindu universe that Suryavarman II had built in stone was about to confront a very earthly reality. The gods themselves were changing. The 30-year sprint was over. Now came the test that would determine whether this monument to Hindu cosmology could survive in a Buddhist world. The race against time had been won, but the race for relevance was just beginning. What happened next should have been the end of Angkor Wat's story. Religious monuments are typically destroyed when new faiths replace old ones. Ask the countless temples, churches, and sacred sites that have been reduced to rubble throughout history when political and spiritual winds shifted. Yet Angkor Wat not only survived the transformation from Hinduism to Buddhism, it somehow managed to become even more sacred, more revered, and more central to Cambodia's spiritual identity than it had ever been before. This transformation represents one of history's most remarkable examples of religious adaptation and cultural evolution. To understand how extraordinary this was, we must first grasp the magnitude of the religious revolution that swept through the Khmer Empire in the late 12th century. Buddhism had coexisted peacefully with Hinduism in Cambodia since around the 5th century, brought by traders and missionaries from India. But coexistence is one thing. Displacement is something else entirely. By the time of Suryavarman II's death in 1150, Buddhism was no longer just an alternative spiritual path. It was becoming the dominant religious force across Southeast Asia, offering a fundamentally different vision of the cosmos' spiritual practice and the relationship between earthly and divine power. The philosophical differences between the two religions could hardly have been more dramatic. Hinduism, as expressed in Angkor Wat, presents a universe of eternal divine hierarchies, where gods reside in fixed cosmic locations and kings rule by divine mandate as earthly representatives of celestial power. The temple itself was built as Vishnu's earthly palace, a place where the god literally resided and from which he exercised cosmic authority alongside his royal representative. Buddhism, by contrast, offered a path to enlightenment that transcended all earthly hierarchies and divine intermediaries. The Buddha was not a god, but an enlightened teacher who had discovered the way to escape the cycle of suffering and rebirth. Buddhist practice emphasized personal spiritual development, compassion for all beings, and the ultimate goal of achieving nirvana, a state of liberation that rendered earthly power structures spiritually irrelevant. These weren't subtle theological differences that could be papered over with diplomatic compromise. They represented completely different understandings of reality itself. A temple built as a cosmic diagram of Hindu divine hierarchy should have been fundamentally incompatible with Buddhist spiritual practice. Logic suggested that the new Buddhist rulers would either destroy Angkor Wat as a relic of discredited beliefs or, at best, allow it to decay into irrelevance. Instead, something miraculous occurred. Rather than destroying or abandoning Angkor Wat, the Buddhist community gradually transformed it into one of the most important Buddhist pilgrimage sites in Southeast Asia. This transformation was so subtle and so respectful that it preserved virtually all of the temple's original Hindu artistic and architectural elements while somehow making them meaningful within an entirely different religious framework. The key to this transformation lay in Buddhism's remarkable theological flexibility and the specific circumstances of its arrival in Cambodia. Unlike many religious conquests, Buddhism didn't arrive through military force or royal decree demanding the destruction of existing sacred sites. Instead, it spread through persuasion, offering spiritual benefits that complemented rather than directly challenged existing beliefs. Buddhist teachers and monks approached Angkor Wat not as a false idol to be destroyed, but as a magnificent expression of human devotion that could be reinterpreted within Buddhist understanding. The cosmic symbolism that represented Hindu divine hierarchy could be understood as illustrations of the illusory nature of earthly existence that Buddhist practice seeks to transcend. The elaborate carvings depicting Hindu epics could serve as teaching tools for Buddhist concepts about karma, suffering, and the path to enlightenment. Perhaps most ingeniously, Buddhist practitioners reinterpreted the temple's westward orientation, originally chosen to align with Suryavarman II's conception of it as his funeral monument, as symbolically appropriate for Buddhist practice. In Buddhist tradition, the West is associated with Amitabha Buddha and the Pure Land, making Angkor Wat's unusual orientation actually more suitable for Buddhist worship than for Hindu ritual. The physical transformation of the temple was carried out with extraordinary sensitivity. Rather than destroying or defacing the Hindu sculptures and reliefs, Buddhist practitioners added their own elements in ways that enhanced rather than replaced the original artistic program. Buddha statues were placed strategically throughout the complex, often in positions where they seemed to be teaching or blessing the Hindu deities rather than replacing them. New Buddhist inscriptions were added alongside the original Hindu texts, creating a multi-layered religious dialogue carved in stone. Buddhist stupas, dome-shaped structures representing the Buddha's enlightened mind, were constructed within the temple complex in locations that complemented the existing architecture rather than competing with it. The transformation extended beyond mere decoration to encompass ritual practice. Buddhist monks developed liturgies and ceremonies specifically adapted to Angkor Wat's unique architectural and spiritual characteristics. The temple's galleries, originally designed for Hindu circumambulation rituals, were perfectly suited for Buddhist walking meditation. The central towers, built to house Hindu deities, became focal points for Buddhist contemplation of impermanence and liberation. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this transformation was how it preserved the temple's cosmic significance while completely recontextualizing its meaning. The Hindu cosmic mountain became a Buddhist representation of the spiritual path from ignorance to enlightenment. The elaborate celestial hierarchies depicted in the bas-reliefs became illustrations of the complex karmic relationships that Buddhist practice seeks to transcend. Historical records show that by the 13th and 14th centuries, Angkor Wat had become a major destination for Buddhist pilgrims from across Southeast Asia. Chinese envoy Zhou Daguan, who visited in the early 14th century, described a thriving Buddhist community centered around the temple. Japanese Buddhist pilgrims established settlements near the temple and left inscriptions recording their visits and spiritual experiences. Even more remarkably, this transformation occurred without any apparent conflict or controversy. There are no historical records of religious disputes, no evidence of iconoclastic destruction, no accounts of forced conversion or resistance to the temple's new role. The transition seems to have been as natural and peaceful as sunrise following night. This peaceful transformation reveals something profound about both religions and about the human capacity for spiritual adaptation. Rather than seeing religious differences as incompatible, the Buddhist community that inherited Angkor Wat found ways to honor the temple's original purpose while serving their own spiritual needs. They demonstrated that sacred spaces can transcend the specific beliefs that created them to serve the deeper human need for connection with the divine. By the end of the 12th century, Angkor Wat had completed one of history's most remarkable religious metamorphoses. Built as the ultimate expression of Hindu cosmic order, it had become one of Buddhism's most revered sacred sites. Yet it had lost none of its original power, beauty, or spiritual significance. If anything, the transformation had enriched its meaning, adding layers of spiritual depth that would sustain its relevance for centuries to come. But even as Angkor Wat successfully navigated the transition from Hindu to Buddhist sanctuary, larger forces were building that would threaten not just the temple, but the entire civilization that had created it. The Khmer Empire itself was about to face challenges that would test whether human achievement, no matter how magnificent, could survive the ultimate enemy: time itself. For 3 centuries after Angkor Wat's completion, the impossible had been sustained. The largest religious monument in the world continued to function as originally designed, a cosmic center where earthly and divine power intersected, supported by an empire that commanded resources across Southeast Asia and maintained the complex infrastructure required to keep such a massive sacred complex operational. But by the early 15th century, cracks were appearing in the foundations of Khmer civilization itself. Cracks that would ultimately force the abandonment of humanity's greatest pre-industrial achievement. The decline of the Khmer Empire wasn't caused by a single catastrophic event, but rather by a perfect storm of environmental, political, and economic pressures that gradually overwhelmed even the most sophisticated civilization Southeast Asia had ever produced. Understanding this decline is crucial because it reveals how even the most magnificent human achievements remain vulnerable to forces beyond any single generation's control. The first enemy was the one the Khmer had originally conquered: water itself. The same hydraulic engineering that had made Angkor possible became its greatest vulnerability when climate patterns began to shift in ways that no medieval civilization could have anticipated or adapted to quickly enough. Climate reconstructions suggest that the 14th and 15th centuries brought increasingly erratic weather patterns to Southeast Asia. The reliable monsoon cycles that had sustained Angkor's agricultural foundation for centuries became unpredictable. Years of devastating floods would be followed by prolonged droughts that stressed the elaborate canal and reservoir system beyond its design limits. The West Barai, that magnificent 5-mile-long reservoir that had once seemed like humanity's triumph over nature, became a liability when drought years made it impossible to maintain water levels. The sophisticated canal network that had transported millions of stone blocks to build Angkor Wat now required constant maintenance to prevent silting and collapse. But maintenance required resources, and resources were increasingly strained by the need to adapt to unpredictable climate conditions. More devastating still, the changing climate patterns disrupted the rice production that fed 750,000 people in the world's largest pre-industrial city. Rice cultivation in tropical climates requires precise timing of planting and harvesting relative to seasonal rains. When those patterns became unreliable, even the most sophisticated agricultural infrastructure couldn't compensate. Crop failures led to food shortages, which led to social unrest, which led to the diversion of resources from infrastructure maintenance to immediate survival needs. But environmental challenges were only part of the story. The Khmer Empire was also facing increasing military pressure from neighboring powers who had grown stronger and more aggressive over the centuries. The kingdom of Ayutthaya to the west and the Vietnamese kingdoms to the east were no longer content to remain tributary states of the Khmer Empire. They had developed their own sophisticated military technologies and organizational systems, and they were actively challenging Khmer dominance across the region. The most devastating blow came in 1177 when the Cham people from modern-day Vietnam actually succeeded in sacking Angkor itself. An attack that demonstrated that even the empire's heartland was no longer invulnerable. Although the Khmer eventually expelled the invaders and rebuilt, the psychological impact was enormous. The cosmic center of the universe had been violated by foreign enemies, calling into question the entire divine mandate that justified Khmer rule. King Jayavarman VII managed to restore Khmer power and even launched the construction of Angkor Thom as a new, more defensible capital city surrounding Angkor Wat. But the resources required for this massive new construction project, combined with the ongoing costs of military defense and climate adaptation, strained the empire's finances beyond the breaking point. The economic mathematics of maintaining Angkor had always been precarious. The temple complex wasn't just a religious center, it was an enormous economic burden that required constant investment in maintenance, staffing, and ceremonial activities. The buildings themselves needed ongoing repairs to withstand tropical weathering. The canal system required dredging and reconstruction after every major storm. The elaborate religious ceremonies demanded enormous quantities of food, textiles, precious metals, and other luxury goods. All of this had been sustainable when the Khmer Empire commanded tribute from vassal states across Southeast Asia and when agricultural production remained stable and predictable. But as military expenses increased, climate challenges reduced agricultural surplus, and tributary relationships weakened, the economic foundation supporting Angkor began to crumble. The empire faced an impossible choice: continue investing enormous resources in maintaining the magnificent but increasingly impractical capital at Angkor, or relocate to a more defensible and economically sustainable location. The decision, when it finally came, was as practical as it was heartbreaking. In the 1430s, the Khmer rulers made the agonizing decision to abandon the great complexes of Angkor and relocate the capital to Phnom Penh, far to the south. This move made perfect strategic sense. Phnom Penh was more defensible against military attacks, closer to growing trade networks, and required far less infrastructure investment to maintain. But it meant abandoning the cosmic center of the universe that had justified Khmer imperial authority for over 5 centuries. The abandonment wasn't immediate or complete. Some communities remained around Angkor Wat, continuing to maintain the temple and conduct religious ceremonies. Buddhist monks continued to use the complex as a meditation center and pilgrimage destination. But the massive infrastructure that had supported 750,000 people was no longer maintained by imperial resources. Without constant maintenance, the sophisticated hydraulic systems that had sustained Angkor began to fail. Canals silted up, reservoirs cracked and leaked, roads became impassable during the rainy season. The urban population gradually dispersed to more sustainable locations, leaving behind empty palaces, abandoned temples, and deteriorating infrastructure. Nature, which the Khmer had so masterfully controlled for centuries, began to reclaim its territory. Tropical vegetation started growing over abandoned buildings. Tree roots penetrated stone joints and gradually prized apart walls that had stood for centuries. Wooden structures rotted away completely, leaving only stone foundations to mark where palaces and administrative buildings had once stood. But remarkably, Angkor Wat itself survived this abandonment better than almost any other structure in the complex. Its solid stone construction, superior drainage systems, and ongoing use by Buddhist communities protected it from the worst ravages of neglect. Unlike many historical sites that are truly abandoned, Angkor Wat was never completely deserted. Buddhist monks continued to care for at least parts of the complex, conducting ceremonies, maintaining basic repairs, and preserving the temple's spiritual significance even as its political importance faded. This partial preservation was crucial because it meant that when European explorers eventually encountered Angkor Wat centuries later, they found not a ruin, but a functioning religious site that had somehow maintained its essential character despite the collapse of the civilization that built it. Yet the contrast was still shocking. Visitors in the 16th and 17th centuries found themselves looking at the world's largest religious monument rising from a jungle that had reclaimed most of the surrounding city. Massive stone temples stood surrounded by trees that had grown through the ruins of palaces and administrative buildings. It was like discovering Atlantis or stumbling upon the remnants of a lost civilization that had achieved impossible things before vanishing into legend. The empire's twilight had ended not with dramatic collapse, but with a slow fade into the green embrace of the jungle. The impossible had become abandoned, but not destroyed. Hidden in the forest, protected by Buddhist devotion and its own magnificent construction, Angkor Wat waited for the world to rediscover what Cambodia had built when building the impossible was just another day's work. But before that rediscovery could happen, Angkor Wat would have to survive centuries of isolation, where its only visitors would be the occasional pilgrim, curious explorer, or treasure hunter. The test now was whether stone and devotion could outlast empires, whether human achievement could survive the civilizations that created it, and whether the world's greatest architectural miracle could endure until humanity was ready to appreciate it again. For over 400 years, from the 15th to the 19th centuries, Angkor Wat existed in a state that seems impossible in our hyper-connected modern world. The largest religious monument on Earth was essentially hidden from global civilization, known only to local Buddhist communities, occasional regional travelers, and the slowly encroaching jungle that threatened to swallow it entirely. This wasn't abandonment. It was something far more mysterious and profound. It was as if humanity had collectively forgotten its greatest architectural achievement, leaving it to survive on its own merits in one of the most challenging environments on the planet. The survival of Angkor Wat during these centuries of isolation represents one of history's most remarkable examples of architectural resilience combined with religious devotion. While the surrounding city crumbled back into jungle and most of the Angkor complex disappeared beneath vegetation, Angkor Wat itself not only endured but continued to function as a sacred site, maintained by Buddhist monks who treated it not as a relic of the past, but as a living spiritual center. This continuity of sacred purpose was crucial to the temple's survival. Unlike truly abandoned ruins that decay rapidly in tropical climates, Angkor Wat retained a community of caretakers who understood its spiritual significance even if they had lost much knowledge of its original Hindu symbolism. Buddhist monks continued to conduct ceremonies in the galleries that had once echoed with Hindu chants. They maintained basic repairs, cleared vegetation from crucial structural elements, and perhaps most importantly, they preserved the temple's reputation as a place of power and spiritual significance. But maintenance by a small monastic community was no match for the relentless assault of Southeast Asian weather. Torrential monsoon rains hammered the temple for months each year, finding every crack and joint where water could penetrate the stone. During the dry season, extreme heat caused the sandstone to expand and contract in cycles that gradually loosened even the most precisely fitted joints. Without the massive maintenance crews that had once kept the temple in perfect condition, subtle damage accumulated year by year, century by century. Perhaps more dramatically, the jungle began its inexorable campaign to reclaim the temple. Tropical vegetation in Southeast Asia doesn't just grow around structures, it actively seeks to penetrate and colonize them. Tree seeds, carried by wind and animals, found purchase in the smallest cracks between stones. As they grew, their roots exerted pressures that gradually prized apart joints that had held firm for centuries. Massive trees began growing directly from the temple walls, their root systems becoming so intertwined with the architecture that removing them would have meant destroying the structures they had both damaged and, paradoxically, helped to support. The most famous example of this botanical colonization occurred at nearby Ta Prohm Temple, where enormous silk cotton trees and strangler figs literally grew through and around the temple structures, creating one of the most photographed architectural scenes in the world. But even at Angkor Wat, which received better maintenance, the constant battle between human preservation and natural reclamation created a temple that existed in an increasingly wild and overgrown state. Yet during these centuries of isolation, Angkor Wat wasn't completely cut off from the outside world. Regional travelers continued to visit, drawn by reports of an impossibly magnificent temple hidden in the Cambodian jungle. Some of these visitors left records that provide tantalizing glimpses of the temple's condition during its centuries of semi-abandonment. Portuguese traders and missionaries following trade routes through Southeast Asia in the 16th century discovered what they described as a vast stone city hidden in the northern Cambodian forests, abandoned for over 150 years. Antonio de Maddalena, a Capuchin friar who explored the ruins in 1586, left one of the first European descriptions of Angkor Wat, calling it a temple of such extraordinary construction that it is not possible to describe it with a pen, particularly since it is like no other building in the world. These early European accounts reveal a temple that was already partially overgrown, but still magnificent. The Portuguese visitors found a structure that clearly demonstrated the achievement of a sophisticated civilization, yet it existed in a state of mysterious isolation that made it seem almost mythical. They encountered local communities who treated the temple with reverence, but who had only fragmentary knowledge of its origins or original purpose. Japanese Buddhist pilgrims also discovered Angkor Wat during this period, drawn by its reputation as a powerful Buddhist site. They left inscriptions dating from the 17th century that record their visits and spiritual experiences. One inscription from 1632 describes Ukondayu Kazufusa celebrating the Khmer New Year at Angkor Wat, indicating that the temple continued to serve as a focal point for regional religious observances even during its period of political isolation. These Japanese visitors created one of the first known maps of Angkor, an annotated colored plan that demonstrates both their appreciation for the temple's architectural complexity and their understanding of its spiritual significance. Their record suggests that while knowledge of Angkor Wat's original Hindu symbolism had largely been lost, its reputation as a place of extraordinary spiritual power had actually increased during its centuries of isolation. The temple during this period existed in a state that was simultaneously magnificent and melancholy. Visitors found galleries filled with some of the most beautiful stone carvings ever created. But many areas were accessible only by climbing over fallen stones and pushing through vegetation. The great central towers still rose majestically above the jungle canopy, but their approaches were often blocked by collapsed structures or impenetrable growth. Local legends grew around the temple during its isolation, transforming it from a historical monument into something approaching mythology. Stories circulated about supernatural guardians who protected the temple, about hidden treasures buried in its foundations, and about spiritual experiences so powerful that they could transform lives. These legends served an important preservation function. They discouraged casual vandalism and treasure hunting while encouraging the kind of respectful treatment that helped the temple survive. The Buddhist community that maintained Angkor Wat during these centuries faced enormous challenges with minimal resources. They had to prioritize which areas of the vast complex to maintain, often making heartbreaking decisions to let some sections deteriorate while focusing their limited resources on preserving the most essential spiritual and structural elements. Their success in keeping the temple's central areas functional and spiritually active represents an extraordinary achievement of faith and determination. Perhaps most remarkably, they managed to preserve not just the physical structure but also the temple's essential character as a place of transcendent beauty and spiritual power. Visitors during the isolation period consistently reported being overwhelmed by the temple's magnificence despite its overgrown and partially deteriorated condition. The combination of architectural grandeur, artistic mastery, and mysterious jungle setting created an atmosphere that many found more spiritually moving than it might have been in its original pristine state. By the early 19th century, rumors of the magnificent hidden temple had reached European intellectual circles, but these reports were often dismissed as travelers' tales or confused with legends about other Southeast Asian ruins. The idea that a civilization capable of building something that surpassed European architectural achievements could have existed in what colonial powers considered a primitive region seemed impossible to many Western minds. But impossibility had never stopped Angkor Wat before. Hidden in plain sight, maintained by faith, protected by jungle, and preserved by its own magnificent construction, the world's largest religious monument waited for humanity to develop the appreciation and understanding necessary to recognize what Cambodia had achieved when the rest of the world was still learning to dream in stone. The centuries of sacred solitude were ending. Soon, the modern world would rediscover what had never truly been lost, and Angkor Wat would begin its transformation from local legend to global wonder. But that rediscovery would bring both salvation and new challenges that would test whether humanity's greatest architectural achievement could survive not just neglect, but fame itself. On January 22, 1860, a French naturalist named Henri Mouhot pushed through the dense Cambodian jungle and emerged into a clearing that would forever change how the world understood human architectural achievement. What he saw there was so magnificent, so impossible by Victorian standards of what primitive Asian civilizations could accomplish, that his first reaction was complete disbelief. Standing before him was Angkor Wat, and his encounter with it would trigger a revolution in Western understanding of global civilization that continues to reverberate today. Mouhot's journal entry that day has become one of the most famous passages in the history of archaeological discovery. One of these temples, a rival to that of Solomon and erected by some ancient Michelangelo, might take an honorable place beside our most beautiful buildings. It is grander than anything left to us by Greece or Rome. For a Victorian European to compare an Asian temple favorably to the sacred monuments of classical antiquity was revolutionary. It challenged fundamental assumptions about cultural superiority that had justified colonial expansion across the globe. But Mohot's discovery reveals as much about European ignorance as it does about Angkor Wat's magnificence. The temple had never been lost to local populations. Buddhist monks had maintained it continuously for centuries. Regional travelers, traders, and pilgrims had visited it regularly. Portuguese and Japanese explorers had documented it centuries before Mohot's arrival. What Mohot discovered wasn't Angkor Wat itself, but rather the Western world's complete ignorance of what existed beyond their colonial outposts. The shock of Mohot's descriptions when they reached European audiences cannot be overstated. Here was proof that non-European civilizations had achieved architectural feats that surpassed anything in medieval Europe. At a time when European colonial powers justified their dominance by claiming cultural and technological superiority, Angkor Wat presented uncomfortable evidence that other civilizations had built wonders that European architects couldn't match even with 19th-century industrial technology. Mohot's detailed descriptions and sketches of Angkor Wat created a sensation in European intellectual circles. The Royal Geographical Society published his accounts to widespread amazement. Scholars struggled to understand how such sophisticated architecture could have emerged from what they considered the Dark Ages of Southeast Asian history. Some initially refused to believe that local civilizations could have built such monuments, proposing various theories about ancient Roman expeditions or lost civilizations that might account for the impossible sophistication they were seeing described. The French colonial administration, which controlled Cambodia as part of French Indochina, quickly recognized that Angkor Wat represented both a scientific treasure and a propaganda opportunity. If French archaeologists could study and restore these monuments, it would demonstrate French commitment to preserving and understanding the cultural heritage of their colonial territories. A narrative that conveniently ignored the centuries of local preservation efforts that had kept the temple functioning. French archaeological expeditions began arriving in the 1860s, led by scholars who were genuinely amazed by what they found, but who also brought colonial assumptions about their role as saviors of neglected cultural heritage. They established the École Française d'Extrême Orient, EFIO, to study and restore Angkor, beginning what would become more than a century of international conservation efforts. These early French archaeological missions faced enormous challenges. Working in tropical conditions with limited transportation and communication, they had to document, analyze, and begin conserving a temple complex that covered over 400 acres and contained thousands of individual architectural and artistic elements. They created the first systematic architectural surveys, produced detailed photographic documentation, and began the delicate work of structural stabilization in a climate that destroyed metal tools and made precise measurement extremely difficult. But the French archaeologists also made discoveries that added new dimensions to Angkor Wat's already impressive story. Their systematic exploration revealed that the temple was only the centerpiece of a vast urban complex that had once housed 750,000 people. Using aerial photography, revolutionary technology in the early 20th century, they began to map the sophisticated hydraulic systems that had supported this massive pre-industrial city. Perhaps most importantly, the French scholars began serious study of the temple's bas-relief carvings and inscriptions, gradually deciphering the complex religious and historical narratives that covered the temple walls. For the first time since the decline of the Khmer Empire, researchers were beginning to understand not just what Angkor Wat looked like, but what it meant to the civilization that had built it. The restoration work that began during the French colonial period was both necessary and problematic. Necessary because centuries of weathering and jungle growth had left many structures dangerously unstable. Problematic because early 20th century conservation techniques often involved replacing original stones with concrete, using chemical treatments that proved harmful over time, and making aesthetic choices that prioritized dramatic visual impact over historical authenticity. Some of the most visible early restoration work involved clearing the temple of the massive trees that had grown through its structures during the centuries of jungle encroachment. This work was photographically dramatic. Images of enormous trees being removed from temple walls made compelling before and after comparisons that demonstrated French conservation efforts. But removing these trees also eliminated natural structural supports that had actually been holding some walls together, leading to collapses that required extensive reconstruction. The French colonial period also marked the beginning of Angkor Wat's transformation into a tourist destination. Colonial administrators built roads and rest houses to accommodate European visitors who wanted to see this wonder of the ancient world. They created guidebooks, postcards, and souvenirs that spread images of Angkor Wat throughout the French Empire and beyond. But tourism also brought new threats. Visitors in the early 20th century often felt entitled to take souvenirs from the temple, small carvings, decorative elements, or even pieces of bas-relief sculpture. The temple's remoteness and the limited security available made it vulnerable to both casual vandalism and systematic looting that removed priceless artistic elements from their original contexts. World War II brought these early conservation and tourism efforts to an abrupt halt. The Japanese occupation of Cambodia from 1941 to 1945 cut off French access to the temple and left it once again under primarily local care. The war demonstrated both the fragility of international conservation efforts and the resilience of local communities who continued to maintain the temple even when outside support disappeared. When French administrators returned after the war, they found that local caretakers had successfully protected Angkor Wat from wartime damage better than many European monuments had survived the conflict. This experience began to shift conservation philosophy toward greater recognition of local expertise and community involvement in preservation efforts. By the 1950s, as Cambodia moved toward independence from French colonial rule, Angkor Wat had completed another remarkable transformation. From a temple known primarily to local Buddhist communities, it had become an internationally recognized symbol of architectural achievement and a source of enormous national pride for the emerging Cambodian state. The Great Rediscovery was complete. The Western world had finally encountered and begun to appreciate what Cambodia had achieved 800 years earlier. But as Angkor Wat prepared to become the symbol of an independent Cambodia, it faced new challenges that would test whether humanity's greatest architectural achievement could survive not just the rise and fall of empires, but the turbulent politics of the modern world. When Cambodia gained independence from France in 1953, Angkor Wat immediately became more than just an ancient monument. It became the defining symbol of Cambodian national identity. The temple's image was placed prominently on the new nation's flag, where it remains today as the only building depicted on any national flag in the world. This wasn't merely symbolic decoration. It was a declaration that modern Cambodia traced its legitimacy directly back to the civilization that had built the impossible and made it endure for nearly 8 centuries. But claiming Angkor Wat as a national symbol also meant that the temple's fate would be inextricably linked to Cambodia's political destiny. Over the next several decades, that destiny would include some of the most devastating conflicts and social upheavals of the 20th century. The question was whether stone and mortar, no matter how magnificently constructed, could survive the human storms that were about to break over Southeast Asia. The first test came with the escalation of the Vietnam War and its spillover into Cambodia. Throughout the 1960s and early 1970s, Cambodia found itself increasingly drawn into a conflict that would eventually consume the entire region. As fighting intensified, international conservation efforts that had been steadily progressing since the French colonial period were forced to halt. Foreign archaeologists and restoration experts evacuated, leaving Angkor Wat once again under primarily local care at a time when the Cambodian government's resources were desperately needed for national defense. The temple complex, located in the northern province of Siem Reap, found itself uncomfortably close to supply routes and strategic positions that various military forces sought to control. The ancient roads that had once carried millions of sandstone blocks to build the temple now carried modern armies and military supplies. The sophisticated water management systems that had sustained the Khmer Empire became strategic resources in a modern conflict where controlling water supplies could determine military success or failure. Despite its proximity to active combat zones, Angkor Wat itself suffered remarkably little direct war damage during this period. The temple's reputation for sacred power, recognized by all sides in the conflict, provided an informal protection that proved more effective than any military guard. Soldiers who might have shown no hesitation in destroying enemy installations approached Angkor Wat with reverence, treating it as a neutral zone that transcended political divisions. But the real test of Angkor Wat's resilience was still to come. In 1975, the Khmer Rouge, led by Pol Pot, seized control of Cambodia and began implementing one of history's most radical and devastating social revolutions. Their goal was to transform Cambodia into an agrarian utopia by completely destroying all traces of modern civilization, foreign influence, and traditional culture. In this context, Angkor Wat represented everything the Khmer Rouge opposed. It was a monument to royal power, religious authority, and cultural sophistication that had been contaminated by centuries of foreign study and tourism. By all logic, Angkor Wat should not have survived the Khmer Rouge period. The regime systematically destroyed temples, libraries, schools, and cultural institutions throughout Cambodia. They murdered intellectuals, artists, religious leaders, and anyone associated with preserving traditional culture. They drove the entire population out of cities and forced them into agricultural labor camps where millions died of starvation, disease, and execution. Yet somehow, impossibly, Angkor Wat not only survived, but emerged from the Khmer Rouge period relatively intact. The temple sustained some damage. Bullet holes are still visible on some outer walls from skirmishes between different factions, but nothing approaching the systematic destruction that befell most other cultural sites in Cambodia. The reasons for this relative preservation remain partially mysterious, but several factors seem to have contributed to the temple's survival. First, the Khmer Rouge, despite their revolutionary ideology, were not immune to the spiritual power that Angkor Wat had represented to Cambodians for centuries. Even radical revolutionaries found it difficult to order the destruction of the most magnificent achievement of Cambodian civilization. The temple represented not just royal and religious authority, but also Cambodian genius and capability that predated any foreign influence or modern corruption. Second, the temple's remote location actually protected it during the chaos of the Khmer Rouge period. While the regime focused its destructive attention on urban areas and more accessible cultural sites, Angkor Wat's distance from major population centers meant it received less systematic attention from authorities whose resources were stretched thin by the demands of managing a completely reorganized society. Third, and perhaps most importantly, local communities continued to protect the temple even during the darkest years of Khmer Rouge rule. Despite the enormous personal risks involved, some individuals maintained basic care for the temple and prevented the worst forms of damage or looting. These unsung heroes demonstrated the same devotion that had sustained Angkor Wat through previous periods of political chaos and abandonment. The Vietnamese invasion that ended Khmer Rouge rule in 1979 brought both relief and new challenges for Angkor Wat. The immediate threat of systematic destruction had passed, but Cambodia remained isolated from the international community due to ongoing political conflicts and the presence of Vietnamese occupation forces. International conservation organizations could not return to Cambodia, leaving the temple vulnerable to neglect and decay during the crucial years immediately following the devastation of the Khmer Rouge period. During the 1980s, as Cambodia slowly began to recover from the Khmer Rouge trauma, Angkor Wat faced threats that were in some ways more dangerous than direct military attack. The collapse of government institutions meant there was no effective security around the temple complex. Art thieves, operating both individually and as part of international smuggling networks, systematically looted portable artifacts and even carved away sections of bas-relief sculpture to sell on the international art market. This period of uncontrolled looting caused more damage to Angkor Wat's artistic heritage than centuries of weathering or decades of political conflict. Irreplaceable carvings disappeared overnight. Statues that had survived 8 centuries of history were stolen and sold to private collectors who cared nothing for their cultural significance or historical context. The temple that had survived war and revolution was being destroyed piece by commercial greed. Local communities once again proved crucial to the temple's survival. Despite having few resources and no official authority, village leaders and Buddhist monks organized informal protection systems that reduced the looting and helped preserve the temple's most important elements. Their efforts couldn't prevent all theft, but they kept the damage from becoming total and irreversible. By the late 1980s, as political stability began to return to Cambodia, international attention once again focused on Angkor Wat's condition. What observers found was both encouraging and alarming. The temple's basic structure remained sound, testament to both its original construction and the devoted care it had received even during the darkest periods. But decades of deferred maintenance, combined with systematic looting, had left it urgently in need of comprehensive restoration and protection. The stage was set for Angkor Wat's next great transformation. From a monument that had survived against all odds to one of the world's most important UNESCO World Heritage Sites, protected by international law and supported by global conservation efforts. The temple had proven it could survive war, revolution, and neglect. Now it would face the challenge of managing success, international attention, and the mixed blessings of becoming one of the world's most famous tourist destinations. The storm had passed. Angkor Wat had endured. But as it prepared for its next chapter as a global icon, the question remained whether humanity's greatest architectural achievement could survive not just destruction, but preservation itself. In 1992, nearly 900 years after its construction began, Angkor Wat achieved a form of protection that its builders could never have imagined. It was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site, placing it under the guardianship of the entire global community. This designation represented both triumph and terror. Triumph because it guaranteed international resources and expertise for the temple's preservation. Terror because it also guaranteed international attention on a scale that could threaten the very monument it was meant to protect. The UNESCO designation was both desperately needed and long overdue. Assessment teams that evaluated Angkor Wat in the early 1990s found a monument that had survived nearly everything history could throw at it, but which was now facing an enemy more subtle and potentially more devastating than war, revolution, or neglect. The accumulated damage of centuries of deferred maintenance, combined with new threats from mass tourism, environmental pollution, and well-intentioned but sometimes misguided restoration efforts. The temple was immediately placed on UNESCO's list of World Heritage in Danger, a designation reserved for sites facing imminent threats to their integrity or survival. The irony was bitter. Angkor Wat had been in genuine danger during wars and political upheavals when it received no international protection, but now that it was finally safe from immediate destruction, it was officially classified as endangered by the very attention and resources that were supposed to save it. The International Coordinating Committee for the Safeguarding and Development of the Historic Site of Angkor, ICC Angkor, was established in 1993 to coordinate what would become one of the largest and most complex conservation efforts in history. Representatives from France, Japan, India, Germany, the United States, South Korea, China, Italy, and other nations brought their expertise, resources, and competing conservation philosophies to bear on challenges that had been accumulating for centuries. The scope of work required was staggering. Teams from the Archaeological Survey of India had to stabilize structures that were literally on the verge of collapse. Japanese conservation experts developed new techniques for cleaning and preserving the intricate bas-relief carvings that covered the temple walls. German specialists focused on protecting the Devata sculptures, the celestial dancers carved throughout the temple, from further erosion and human damage. French archaeologists continued the work their predecessors had begun nearly a century earlier, but with modern techniques and a much better understanding of the long-term consequences of conservation interventions. But even as international teams worked to save Angkor Wat stones, they had to confront a more fundamental question. How do you preserve a monument that was designed to be visited and experienced while protecting it from the very people who come to appreciate it? The answer would require innovations in conservation science, tourism management, and international cooperation that had never been attempted on such a scale. The tourism challenge was unprecedented. When Angkor Wat was inscribed on the World Heritage List, it received approximately 7,650 visitors per year. By 2019, that number had exploded to over 2.6 million annual visitors, a 340-fold increase that subjected the temple to foot traffic, vibrations, humidity changes, and physical wear that its builders never could have anticipated. Every footstep on ancient stones, every breath exhaled in enclosed spaces, every flash photograph represented microscopic damage that accumulated into serious conservation concerns. The Cambodian government found itself balancing impossible competing demands. Tourism revenue from Angkor Wat had become crucial to the national economy, providing employment for hundreds of thousands of people and generating foreign currency that helped fund the country's development. But that same tourism success threatened to destroy the monument that attracted it, creating a paradox that challenged every assumption about sustainable heritage management. Conservation teams developed innovative solutions that sound more like science fiction than archaeology. They created detailed 3D laser scans of every surface of the temple, creating digital archives so precise that if any section were destroyed, it could be reconstructed down to the millimeter. They developed new materials and techniques for stabilizing ancient stones without altering their appearance or compromising their historical authenticity. They installed monitoring systems that continuously track structural stability, environmental conditions, and visitor impact. Perhaps most innovatively, they began treating Angkor Wat not as a static monument, but as a living ecosystem where human activity, natural processes, and conservation interventions all had to be balanced in dynamic equilibrium. This approach recognized that the temple had survived not by remaining unchanged, but by adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining its essential character and structural integrity. The restoration work revealed discoveries that added new dimensions to Angkor Wat's already incredible story. Ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive archaeological techniques found evidence of a complex urban landscape that extended far beyond the visible temple structures. Researchers discovered that the temple precinct, bounded by its moat and wall, had not been used exclusively by the priestly elite as previously thought, but had contained low-density residential occupation, road grids, ponds, and other features that made it more like a sacred city than an isolated temple. In 2015, University of Sydney researchers announced the discovery of previously unknown buried towers that had been built and demolished during Angkor Wat's original construction, as well as a massive wooden structure of unknown purpose on the temple's south side. These findings suggested that the construction process had been even more complex and experimental than previously imagined, with the builders constantly refining and revising their cosmic blueprint as work progressed. But the most significant discovery was perhaps the simplest, that local Cambodian communities had never stopped being the temple's most effective guardians. International conservation efforts succeeded not by replacing local knowledge, but by combining it with modern scientific techniques and global resources. The temple's survival through centuries of political upheaval had depended on local devotion and understanding that no amount of foreign expertise could replace. By 2004, 12 years after being placed on the World Heritage in Danger list, Angkor Wat was removed from that designation, a recognition that international conservation efforts had successfully stabilized the immediate threats to the temple's survival. But this success also marked the beginning of a new phase in the temple's history, where the challenge shifted from emergency preservation to long-term sustainable management of humanity's most visited archaeological site. The UNESCO era had proven that global cooperation could mobilize resources and expertise on a scale sufficient to preserve even the most complex and threatened monuments. Teams from dozens of countries had demonstrated that cultural heritage truly does belong to all humanity, and that protecting it is both a shared responsibility and a shared benefit. But the UNESCO era also revealed that preservation brings its own challenges. Success in saving Angkor Wat had made it more famous, which brought more visitors, which created new threats, which required new solutions, which attracted more attention, a cycle that could theoretically continue until the monument was preserved to death by the very people trying to save it. As Angkor Wat prepared to enter the 21st century as one of the world's most famous and most protected monuments, it faced the ultimate irony. Having survived war, revolution, neglect, and natural disaster, it now had to survive success itself. The question was whether humanity's greatest architectural achievement could adapt once more, finding new ways to balance preservation with access, protection with appreciation, and conservation with the simple human need to experience transcendent beauty in person. The temple that had been built to last forever was about to find out if forever could accommodate 2.6 million visitors per year. Today, as you read these words, Angkor Wat continues to rise from the Cambodian landscape exactly as it has for nearly 900 years. The sun still rises behind its eastern towers during the spring equinox, just as the temple's architects calculated it would in 1116 CE. The cosmic alignments they embedded in stone still function perfectly. The mathematical proportions they carved into every measurement still reflect the harmony they sought to capture between earthly architecture and universal order. In a world obsessed with the newest technologies and the latest innovations, humanity's greatest architectural achievement remains a 900-year-old monument to what human beings can accomplish when they decide that impossible is just another word for not yet attempted. But Angkor Wat's true significance extends far beyond its role as a stunning tourist destination, or even as a masterpiece of architectural achievement. In our age of rapid change, environmental crisis, and global interconnection, this ancient temple offers lessons that are urgently relevant to contemporary challenges facing human civilization. The first lesson is about sustainability on an almost incomprehensible scale. While modern buildings are designed to last decades and considered successful if they survive a century, Angkor Wat was built to endure for millennia, and it has succeeded. The temple's longevity wasn't accidental. It was the result of engineering principles, material choices, and construction techniques that prioritized permanence over convenience, beauty over efficiency, and cosmic harmony over short-term costs. In an era when we struggle to build infrastructure that can withstand climate change, Angkor Wat demonstrates what becomes possible when civilizations plan for the long term rather than the next quarterly earnings report. The temple has survived nearly 900 years of tropical storms, earthquakes, wars, political upheavals, and environmental challenges that have destroyed countless other structures. It represents proof that human beings can create things that outlast not just individual lifetimes, but entire civilizations. The second lesson concerns the relationship between ambition and achievement. The Khmer Empire didn't build Angkor Wat by accepting limitations or compromising their vision to match available resources. Instead, they expanded their capabilities to match their ambitions. They developed new technologies, organized unprecedented workforces, and created logistics systems that could support projects beyond anything previously attempted. When they needed to move mountains of stone across impossible distances, they didn't scale back their vision. They figured out how to move mountains. This approach offers a stark contrast to contemporary tendencies to define problems by existing solutions rather than developing new solutions to match the scale of challenges we face. Climate change, global poverty, and environmental degradation are problems that require Angkor Wat-scale thinking. Ambitious visions backed by innovative engineering, international cooperation, and long-term commitment that transcends political cycles and quarterly profit targets. The third lesson addresses the relationship between diversity and strength. Angkor Wat succeeded because it synthesized influences from Hindu, Buddhist, Chinese, and indigenous Khmer traditions rather than rejecting foreign ideas in favor of cultural purity. The temple represents one of history's most successful examples of cultural fusion, where different traditions contributed their best elements to create something greater than any single culture could have achieved alone. In our current era of rising nationalism and cultural division, Angkor Wat stands as monuments to the power of synthesis over separation. The temple's enduring beauty and spiritual significance derive precisely from its ability to integrate diverse influences into a harmonious whole. The cosmic symbolism is Hindu. The artistic techniques show Chinese influence. The architectural innovations are purely Khmer, and the preservation over centuries has depended on Buddhist devotion. Yet the result is not a confused mixture, but a unified masterpiece that transcends any single cultural tradition. The fourth lesson concerns the importance of maintaining long-term vision during short-term crises. Angkor Wat's construction spanned 3 decades and survived multiple political transitions, military conflicts, and economic pressures that could have justified abandoning or scaling back the project. Yet the temple was completed, according to its original cosmic specifications, because successive generations remained committed to a vision larger than immediate circumstances. This persistence offers crucial insights for addressing contemporary global challenges that require sustained effort across multiple political administrations and economic cycles. Projects like mitigating climate change, eliminating global poverty, or exploring space require Angkor Wat-style commitment to long-term goals despite short-term obstacles and setbacks. Perhaps most importantly, Angkor Wat teaches us about the relationship between individual effort and collective achievement. The temple wasn't built by a single genius architect or through the vision of one remarkable king. It succeeded because it mobilized the skills, dedication, and creativity of hundreds of thousands of people working toward a shared goal that transcended individual interests. The master stone carvers who spent years perfecting individual sculptures, the engineers who solved unprecedented logistical challenges, the workers who transported millions of stone blocks across jungle and river, the administrators who coordinated this vast enterprise, and the communities who have maintained the temple for centuries, all contributed essential elements to an achievement that none could have accomplished alone. This collaborative model offers hope for addressing contemporary challenges that seem impossibly complex when approached individually, but become manageable when approached collectively. The same species that built Angkor Wat 900 years ago, with nothing but human muscle, animal power, and ingenious engineering could certainly address climate change, eliminate poverty, and explore the cosmos if we could organize ourselves with similar vision, commitment, and collaborative spirit. But perhaps Angkor Wat's most profound lesson is about the relationship between humanity and time itself. In an age of instant communication, rapid technological change, and shortened attention spans, the temple reminds us of what becomes possible when human beings think in centuries rather than moments. The builders of Angkor Wat understood that the most meaningful achievements often require more time than individual lifetimes can provide, but that this doesn't make them impossible. It makes them intergenerational. Today, as morning light illuminates the towers of Angkor Wat exactly as it has for 900 years, millions of visitors from around the world gather to witness something that transcends the ordinary limitations of human achievement. They come not just to see beautiful architecture or impressive engineering, but to experience proof that human beings can create things of permanent value, lasting beauty, and universal significance. In a world often focused on what divides us, Angkor Wat stands as evidence of what unites us: the capacity for vision, the ability to solve impossible problems through cooperation and persistence, and the deep human need to create something meaningful that will outlast our individual existence. The temple that began as one king's attempt to build heaven on earth has become humanity's reminder that we are capable of achievements far greater than we typically imagine. Every stone in its walls whispers the same message. The impossible is just another project waiting for sufficient vision, commitment, and collective effort. Standing before Angkor Wat today, whether in person or in imagination, we face the same choice that confronted Suryavarman II 9 centuries ago. We can accept the limitations that circumstances seem to impose, or we can decide to build something impossible and discover what human beings can accomplish when we refuse to accept that anything worthwhile is beyond our reach. Cambodia built the world's largest religious monument before anyone else because they understood something we sometimes forget. The only real limitation on human achievement is the willingness to attempt the impossible. The question facing our generation is not whether we can build Angkor Wat. The question is what impossible thing we're going to build next. We began this journey with a simple question. How did Cambodia build the world's largest religious monument before anyone else? The answer, as we've discovered, is both more complex and more inspiring than we could have imagined. From the cosmic blueprint that transformed Hindu mythology into architectural reality, to the impossible logistics of moving 10 million stone blocks across 50 kilometers of jungle, to the master craftsman who carved eternity into sandstone with tools that would seem primitive by today's standards, Every aspect of Angkor Wat's creation defied the supposed limitations of 12th century technology and organization. We witnessed the 30-year race against mortality that saw 300,000 workers and 6,000 elephants coordinated in history's largest construction project. We marveled at the peaceful religious transformation that converted a Hindu cosmic mountain into one of Buddhism's most sacred sites without destroying a single carving. We followed the temple through the empire's twilight and abandonment, through centuries of sacred solitude maintained by devoted monks, through rediscovery by a shocked Western world, and through survival against impossible odds during wars and revolutions that destroyed entire civilizations. Most remarkably, we've seen how Angkor Wat became not just a monument to one civilization's achievement, but a guardian of lessons humanity desperately needs today. In an age struggling with climate change, cultural division, and shortened attention spans, this 900-year-old temple demonstrates the power of long-term thinking, international cooperation, and the courage to attempt projects that transcend individual lifetimes. The Khmer Empire built Angkor Wat by refusing to accept that anything worthwhile was impossible. When they needed new technologies, they invented them. When they needed unprecedented organization, they created it. When they needed to move mountains, they moved them. When they needed to build the universe in stone, they figured out how. Their achievement stands as permanent proof that human beings can accomplish anything we're willing to commit to completely. The same species that created Angkor Wat with medieval technology could certainly address any challenge facing our contemporary world if we could approach our problems with the same ambition, persistence, and collaborative spirit. Every morning for nearly 900 years, the sun has risen behind Angkor Wat's towers exactly as its architects calculated. Every day, millions of precisely fitted stones continue to support each other without mortar or metal, just as their builders intended. Every moment, this impossible monument continues to whisper its eternal message. The greatest limitation on human achievement is not technology, resources, or circumstances. It's the willingness to believe that the impossible is just another word for not yet accomplished. Cambodia didn't just build the world's largest religious monument first. They built a permanent reminder of what humanity can achieve when we dare to dream in stone and refuse to accept limitations as final answers. The only question remaining is, what impossible thing will we build next?